Fleury for understanding that there is a need in the community for an array of social and educational programs for our longest standing members of Temple Emmanuel and members of the greater Newton area. Temple Emmanuel offers adapted seated exercise for our active older adults, Zumba Gold, L'Chaim Music, entertainment, memory cafe, caregiver support groups, adult support group, heartful afternoons, and a healthy living series. I want to introduce Megan Romeo from Benchmark Assisted Living at Evans Park. Benchmark has graciously underwritten this series, and I just want to introduce her quickly before we get on with the program.
Hello, everyone.
We lost you.
Oop. All right. There we go. Just a little bit of technical difficulties there. I just wanted to thank everyone for being a part of today's presentation. Especially thank you to Tracy for inviting me to be a part of such a great opportunity to be able to provide some education in need for our local community. I also want to thank Audrey and Dawn for their expertise, their education, and their willingness to share their expertise with all of us. I know that this is certainly so very special for me to be able to learn right along with all of you. I have family members that this will be certainly very, very special for them to know. If you all have any questions for me or about Evans Park at Newton Corner specifically, please don't hesitate to reach out to Tracy. She would be happy to connect us. Thank you for attending, and I look forward to tonight's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Thank you very much. And I want to thank elder law attorney Don Friedman and care manager Audrey Zabin for putting in countless hours to prepare for this series. They've been wonderful. So let's get started.
There's just one more thing before we started. We asked that everyone just keeps the mics muted. We want to just make sure that Don and Audrey stay front and center for everybody. And so that will help us facilitate that. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm just forwarding an email to.
And Don, I think we are ready.
Okay.
Okay, great. Tracy, you're muted.
I apologize. Dawn, I'm an active older adult and I've been independent all my life and attended to my own affairs. What happens today if I wake up tomorrow with COVID-19 or a heart attack or God forbid something, and I'm rushed to the hospital? What happens? What's the scenario?
Well, let me approach that question in a couple of different ways. One is sort of what you may need to do today. The other thing is really what you should have done some time ago.
The past.
Before you were in this crisis and then were forced to make decisions in crisis or your family in crisis. Let me say also that just by way of overall overview of my remarks that I think meshes with Audrey's is that we've both provided a lot of material. There's a long paper of mine and Audrey has a lot of material that's available. I don't know whether it's all been distributed yet or not to registrants, but it is available. We're going to be talking about kind of large pictures of things tonight. There's a lot more detail in the material, so don't feel frantically that you have to be taking notes. I'll be mentioning some things not in the paper, but the paper is the bulk of it. So let me first do the step back and then the step forward. Now, there are things that the law allows you to do to sort of set the stage for the situation which may arise in your future of being unable to make or communicate decisions. It could become as a result of a motorcycle accident at age 35 or progressive dementia at 92. But the laws sort of set these mechanisms in place that gives you the power to really exercise some control over that future decision if that situation arises. Really, they're two basic, no particular reason why they're separated, but legally just as quickly as they were. There is a procedure available to deal with legal and financial decision making, and another procedure for medical decision making. And the power of attorney is the primary document on the legal and financial side. And on the healthcare side, there are actually several things now. And I'll go through this in a little more detail in a moment. The healthcare proxy, the medical directive, there's a general information release, which is helpful, and there's a new procedure called the MOST. Now, let me jump ahead a little bit. Let's say that you've done this and you're finding yourself needing to go to the hospital. If among the other things you've done is to have available to you if you have a little hospital kit by the door, as some people do as they're getting older, then it's with you. If you've acted really in advance and gotten it into your electronic medical record, then you really don't have to think about it at all. But let me focus a little bit. Audrey's going to talk a lot about the mechanics of what to do at that last minute. Let me back up first and talk a little bit more about these other things, and then we'll go to your immediate question. The durable power of attorney, I think the most important thing, most important point I'd like to make is that it is not a magic bullet, good in one form for everybody. It's assumed to be kind of like an aspirin. You can get it off the web or just sign something, and if it's called the durable power of attorney, then it's adequate. But it is hugely powerful and really carries with it a number of very specific decisions which really have to be thought out carefully in advance. A standard form, for example, may have language in it that says basically that the person holding the power can do anything that you could do if you were personally present and able to make the decision yourself. That's the broadest power. And that may sound like a decent idea. It's nice and flexible, but it also includes things like signing away your house, or deeding property or making transfers of assets over which you may have no control in the future. Also, even the naming of the person is a delicate matter. It really has to be thought out. Name a spouse. What if your spouse is getting a little on the incapacitated side herself? Might it be better to maybe name your spouse in conjunction with another family member as a dual appointee so that there can be some easy transition in roles? So that's that. The healthcare proxy is for medical decision making. Goes into effect only if a person is found to be unable to make or communicate decisions. And then the person having the power, the healthcare agent, has a lot of authority. They can't direct care. The limitation's often misunderstood. They can give consent to care or refuse consent, but that implies that somebody's asking for the consent. The doctor is making a proposal. You can't go in and ask for an appendectomy, or you can't go in and ask for a piece of some medication that the doctor isn't going to prescribe. So it doesn't really let you drive the train, but it gives you some control over what's going on. Medical advance directive is related specifically to end of life. And this is really intended as your personal statement of your preferences about treatment at end of life, often referred to as a living will. There are lots of forms, 5 wishes, 3 wishes, 5 wishes. There are things available on websites that can be helpful for 5 wishes for this having that discussion. There is a general medical release that we often use in this context. The healthcare proxy doesn't go into effect until you're actually certified by your doctor as being incapacitated. It is sometimes useful from the elder's point of view or the older person's point of view to allow their children or even the spouse to have access to medical information and be able to talk to the doctor freely about your situation. The doctor can't do that unless he gets a separate consent signed each time, or unless you've signed this sort of general authorization. So that's helpful. I want to say a little bit about the MOLST. The MOLST stands for the Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. It's a relatively new procedure in Massachusetts and nationally now, really just starting in the mid-90s with trials. The idea is that this is really a portable medical order form. Its origin really has to do with do not resuscitate orders that are given in a hospital setting. A DNR, a do not resuscitate order, is a medical order directed to nurses and other doctors not to act actively to resuscitate an individual if they have a cardiac arrest or stop breathing. DNRs can only be used in a medical setting, however, by law. And what has evolved through the 90s and the years since has been a situation where many more people are spending longer and longer times in their lives at home or in alternative care settings like assisted living. And these situations of a cardiac arrest with a person who has long been ill and severely ill tend to be happening more and more in non-hospital settings. People aren't dying in the hospital, they're dying before they get there. They're spending less time in nursing homes, more time in assisted living and at home. So the MOLST is really intended to be like a DNR that is enforceable in non-healthcare settings like at home. It's why it's this bright, bright pink color, and you're directed to post it on your refrigerator where it's visible from the front door so that EMTs coming to the house can actually be aware of it and then act on it. My sense, and this is just anecdotal, but my sense is that doctors are raising the MOLST issue with elders generally. And it's really not intended for that. If you look at the MOLST literature, and Audrey, I know you've got opinions on this as well, but if you look at the MOLST literature, it plainly is intended for people who already have a severe illness, or they've got a progressive dementia, or they're on some course, they've been in a serious accident and death has been being considered as a realistic outcome of their current situation. In fact, the MOLST literature itself talks about MOLST is appropriate to use when a DNR conversation would be appropriate to have. Now, I'm going in for a colonoscopy in another week. I'm going to be signing consent forms. I hope that they're not going to be proposing that I talk about a MOLST form with them for a colonoscopy, even though I'm 73. So, but it's beginning to come to that. But I think, all right. So that's no. All right. So let me stop now. And turn it over both for two things really, Audrey. I'd like you to address. One is these things like the durable power and the healthcare proxy, where you're involving kids and family members in a sort of a human resources sort of exercise of figuring out who's going to help you, how, and when. I've always said to clients, look, this is a conversation you really need to have with family, with your family's advisor. This is a personal family issue. Legal technicalities we'll get to, but it's got to be over that. So maybe if you could talk both about that, about the kind of conversations that have to be held before they come to the lawyer, and also about the sort of the last minute stuff.
And also, Audrey, if you can just clarify, if someone is single and doesn't have a spouse or a partner or doesn't have children, that's a whole other issue, because Dawn was mentioning, like for myself, my husband, or my kids can become a healthcare proxy when I'm older. But what if you're an older adult and you don't have relatives, you don't have any spouses? Talk to us about that as well.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. As Tracy mentioned, I'm Audrey Zabin. I'm a care manager. I am a social worker by training, and I've worked in the field of elder care, including hospice, for over 20 years. And actually, in that time, I think the conversation has changed, but some things do remain constant. It is, if you want to give your family, your children, your friends who mean the most to you a gift, it is to have a conversation about how you wish to proceed with medical and end-of-life decision-making before you need it. And the reason you want to do this, because there are no dress rehearsals here. And you don't want anyone to feel any regret about the decisions they made in your stead. You want them to understand and know what you want, because your leaving is going to be upsetting enough to them, but at least they can find some comfort in knowing that they they followed and respected your wishes. So I see this as a gift that you give your family, that you have this conversation. And my suggestion is it's very timely right now. I mean, I know it's COVID, so our Thanksgivings are a bit unique this year, but hopefully you will be having some kind of communication or connection with your family. And this is the time to make your wishes known. I will warn you about a couple of things. It is my strong recommendation, if you can, to not have all of your decision makers be of the same age as yourself, of the same generation of yourself. Yes, most of us, our spouses, are also our decision makers. However, I think it's also helpful if you have a second that you have someone of another generation. Because let's face it, things happen as we get older, and that person may not be available or well enough to assist you. Sorry?
Everything okay?
I will say something about the MOLST document, because Don is right, I have an opinion on this. There's a big push in our state that everybody have an end-of-life decision-making document. And in our state, we are using the MOLST. Doctors are using the MOLST. The primary care doctors are using the MOLST, MOLST, which is short for Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. And I did send a copy along as a handout. It's not the hot pink version, but it just gives you, it is a copy, so it gives you the questions asked. And the correct way to use this now is with sitting down with your primary care doctor to discuss this document and the questions. And in fact, your primary care physician or your doctor needs to sign this with you. And like Don said, it's hot pink. It's supposed to be on the refrigerator because it is something that has some kind of conformity now. It's a document that has some conformity in our healthcare system, which for any of you who work within the healthcare system is a pretty fast, immediate kind of quick response kind of work. And we need something that we can pull quickly to understand.
So Audrey, in an emergency situation when people aren't thinking, do we need to like physically bring documents? If, there's all of a sudden there's somebody's very, very sick, you're supposed
Yes.
to, well, I need to bring the healthcare proxy and I need to bring the MOLST so what are we supposed to do about all of that?
So actually one of the other handouts for all of us, I don't care what your age is, there's an attachment called a vial of life. And in that vial of life is information. It's a form that you fill out that has pertinent and important medical information about all of us. It can be your medication list. It can be the MOLST or your healthcare proxy. But these are all things you should actually keep on your refrigerator. And our ambulance drivers are trained to look on the refrigerator. In Massachusetts, they're trained to look on the fridge to see if there are any important documents to take with them. And I urge you to take them with you because you can't always count on the receptionist to go into the Epic Medical Center and pull up what you need, okay? And you may not be able to represent yourself adequately. You may not remember. So this way there's a record of who you are and what you need. And that record should also go to your decision makers. So if you have a niece in Buffalo, New York, who is your healthcare proxy, your second, that niece should have those records.
Let me ask,
They should have a copy, but you take it with you.
let me ask you, I know with my own parents, I asked my mother questions and wrote them out because the healthcare proxy just says who is the agent, but it doesn't answer. There's no space to answer all those like in between questions. Do you recommend people doing that? Like asking, well, where is the scenario? My mom wanted to be resuscitated. That was her plan, not a DNR. So if somebody wants that, but you ask your parent or her spouse, what is the turning point where you would want the DNR? So how do we state that? You can't state that on the healthcare proxy. How do we do that?
Well, first of all, the decision maker, right, needs to have a conversation like you did with your mom about your wishes, because the doctor and the healthcare provider is going to turn to you as the decision maker to answer those questions. Okay. So for example, there was a COVID-19 MOLST that was produced. I don't know if you saw that,
Mhm.
Don, but there's a COVID-19 MOLST because of intubation.
Oh,
Because, you know, we were intubating people a lot, and former directives were, you know, patients were saying no intubation, but then with COVID-19, some people changed their minds. So they changed the most on that. But you need to have an understanding with your loved one who's going to be your decision maker on this. Advanced directives usually spell these things out in some detail.
Maybe I can just interject a minute
Yeah.
just on that specific point. We do two documents in this context. The healthcare proxy we like being just a simple appointment of the individual, identifies the decision maker. Nothing complicated, nothing that has to be read at length and understood and digested. That person is the one who's responsible then for making the end of life decision about withdrawing or withholding care. What we'd like to have the client do is prepare a second document, call it an advanced medical directive. It's sometimes referred to as a living will. This is the thing that goes into that's the spaces, Tracy, you were talking about. This is the thing that says, if I lose my ability to do this or that, or if I can't comprehend, if I can't appreciate the love that people are feeling for me, whatever, you know, it's personal, it's emotional, then that's a separate document. We'd like to keep it separate so that that's the document for the family. That's the document for the person who's going to make the decision. They're the ones who really have to know the insides of your mother's thinking on this. You don't have to get the doctors involved in that. You know, and that keeps it separate. Then you don't have you're not giving the doctor in the emergency room this 5 pages of notes on your mother's wishes. You know, he's just got what he needs or she needs is just the authorization that this is the person who can sign the consent.
When you go to the hospital, you have medical care, you're actually talking to two separate entities, right? And you're preparing for two separate entities or people. One is the care providers, right? So you want to be clear, make sure they have the information they need, make sure they understand your wishes. And then you want to prepare information, documents, information for the decision makers. So there are two separate audiences that you are addressing.
but again, I just want to point out, if somebody doesn't have family, And
So,
they think they're having this heart attack. They call 911, but there's no family around to help them. And the second one, Dawn, is if today, it's very different, as you know, than years ago. If two people are cohabitating, but they're not actually married, how does that work in terms of legality? If two women are living together, or two men, or man and woman, however it is, but they're not actually married, can that partner, that longstanding partner, be a representative? So if you could both answer both of those questions.
All right, maybe I'll answer the legal
Yeah.
side, and then maybe you can talk about the informal arrangements and how people can
sure.
find people to coordinate, do this for each other, that sort of thing. On the legal issue, I think the important point actually is that nobody has legal standing or the legal right to say that I'm the decision maker. It's not if you're married or not. Even if you're married, your spouse doesn't have that power to say that I'm the spouse, I get to make the decision. You yourself, the patient, the person who signs the form, gets to choose. And there's circumstances where you may choose not to name the spouse, either because you're afraid the spouse couldn't manage
Make
the
the
emotional
decision.
load of having to make the decision, or that they wouldn't have the strength to make the decision you really want them to make regarding terminating care, or that the spouse is not in a situation where they still have the sort of the cognitive wherewithal to really weigh through the medical pros and cons of alternative courses of treatment. So there may well be, this is something you plainly need to talk through. It's come as a surprise in the family that your daughter's named, not your spouse, but it's still a choice, and it can go outside the family. We certainly have
Right.
clients who are in such dysfunctional family situations that they really want to go to a friend or somebody outside, a sibling of theirs, or an in-law sibling, or somebody in the farther reaches. Sometimes there are religious conflicts, and one of the keystones of the healthcare proxy is that you're making a decision based on the principal's perspectives, not your own. The person who's signing, not your stuff.
Right.
And if the child and the parents are in different religion, tradition, and maybe they're afraid they're going to be swayed by that, they might well go to their priest or minister or somebody for some help in identifying somebody else.
Mm.
But so certainly, then specifically on your question, it's perfectly okay to name a partner. There's no limitation. There's no preference. There's no right or disqualification in any role.
Okay.
I mean, I think the main thing is that you have to be communicating with that decision maker, that you're able to communicate and continue that communication.
And so is that where you come in? If somebody is an older adult and lives by themselves and doesn't have heirs, then they contact
Yes.
you?
And so to answer that, there are actually a couple of answers. First of all, there actually are professional people who will do this for a living, who will be attorneys, often act as a power of attorney for people, and or healthcare proxy. And there are things in our, in our legal system, we have guardianships for people who don't have family and are unable to make their own decisions. So there are some systems in place for that. I have to say, over the years I've worked, I always enjoy working with single people, single elders, because they're very organized and they plan. They're usually well-planned people because they are aware they have to make decisions ahead of time, and they do find people in place. And, often people come with teams of decision makers. They find experts in certain areas. So for example, this single woman may have a nephew who's very good at finance, and he becomes the power of attorney. And maybe she has a niece who is a social worker, an MD, and that person becomes the healthcare proxy, and they get together a team of decision makers for themselves, and a family of sorts to make decisions.
Can you explain, you mentioned Vial of Life, and there's forms HIPAA and HCP. Can you explain a little bit more what that is?
Sure. Well, HCP is healthcare proxy,
Oh,
just
okay.
short for the
Oh,
healthcare
okay.
proxy.
Okay, I should have known that.
And we refer to it as HCP. The HIPAA release forms are, okay, I may need some help done with the acronym. HIPAA is Health Information Portability.
Portability, something act. Yeah,
Okay,
whatever.
Accessibility and Accountability Act, and it's HIPAA, which is a release of information form. You know, we all have, we are all protected by confidentiality for our health information. And no one can speak to anyone about anybody else's health record unless the treater gets permission to do so, or the facility. So we have what are called HIPAA release forms today that people sign.
So you fill out those forms. So if an adult child goes with an elder parent,
Right.
the elder
Right.
parent is starting to have, let's say, dementia or something like that, you fill out the forms.
It's important for you all to note that just because you're a healthcare proxy doesn't give you permission to find out information about another person. If a person is competent, if that patient is still competent and able to make their own decisions, it's only if that healthcare proxy is activated. And done legally, it's activated by the doctor just activating it.
Yeah, well, there's a procedure, but it's not really followed very carefully. The doctor is supposed to make a decision. It says the treating physician. I'm not sure exactly what that means. We usually think of the primary care, but it could be in the hospital. It could be the hospitalist. Makes a decision that the person is not able currently, could be temporary or longer term, not able to make or communicate medical decisions. The physician is supposed to tell the patient that he's made this determination and that what the effect of that is, and that the person has a right to object to this. And none of that actually ever happens in my experience. But once she signs the form indicating that she's made this finding, then the person who's named in the proxy technically has the authority then to obtain information. Family members can talk to the doctor. Doesn't prevent you from providing information to the doctor, and so it's a very important workaround. If you don't have to say, as long as the doctor knows what's going on, what information you're going to get from him is maybe not that important.
But one of the, when you have a patient with dementia and you're trying to work with the team, the medical team, I will often say to a doctor, can you just listen to me and may I tell you what I observe? Okay, so that alleviates any concern the doctor has about their violating any confidence or HIPAA. So that's typically one of the ways you can work around that, so you can at least get the doctor to know what they need to know.
Tracy, I'm wondering, I know when you mentioned some of your questions before, some of them related specifically to issues about protecting yourself in the event that you have a long-term illness and need care, might need long-term care. One of your questions I know related to that. Is that something that I'd like to just kind of look at the clock? There are a couple of other kind of major topics.
Well, I just wanted to quickly ask, if someone's a durable power of attorney for a parent, and then that parent or spouse or whoever it is passes away, can you just explain how that stops? Your power of attorney for a loved one. Can you tell us a little bit more?
As a matter of law, it just ends with death. It's not that durable. The durability has to do with becoming incapacitated, which makes no sense to people at all because that's what it's for. It survives that. before they had durable powers, it became the attorney named, and so it ends with death, and which actually raises a very important point. I'll just do that one first, since you gave me the lead to it. And that has to do with sort of getting things organized before you die in order to help make that transition
Right, and
as,
I wanted
as
to ask
smooth as
you,
possible.
I wanted to
Take
ask
it
you,
either ask me the Medicare, Medicaid questions, the Medicare, Medicaid questions. Maybe ask me that next.
okay. But before that, I just wanted to ask you if that happens, you'll talk about probate and being an
Right.
executor.
That's more. Yeah, I'm sort of dealing, kind of thinking, kind of chronologically, what we can do way in advance, what we can do when we begin to think concretely about what kind of care I need, and then when I'm really thinking about dying, that's sort of the last stage, and that gets into the whole
Okay.
probate issue. I think we're still in that kind of
Okay.
middle range. I think.
So, sure, tell us more about, just Medicare, Medicaid, how this all works, and give some more options for
All right.
this.
All right. All right. Sometimes when I get a phone call and somebody will have done a lot of homework, they listen to a lot of radio shows, and they read the articles, and they say, I really don't need a long discussion on this. What I really want is an irrevocable trust. I've thought about it, and that's what I want. And this is it's a problem for me, because I don't know that it's the right tool for them. Even more than that, I don't know what they really want to accomplish. I mean, irrevocable trust or Medicare eligibility or Medicaid eligibility are just tools. They're the means of getting somewhere. And unless people either before or after they talk to me sort of go back to really what needs to be a prior decision about really a life planning decision about what they want to accomplish in their older age range. What are their goals, their objectives for themselves, for their families, relationships with their families? If they're still working, what are their goals with regard to retirement and what they're going to do post-retirement? All of that is really necessary information to really put a plan together on what to do about long-term care. We can talk about long-term care insurance and other devices, but part of it is just financial planning. But I think the key thing, and I want to flip this back to Audrey first, and this had been a topic also in the first program, is sort of what do I, as I'm getting older, what kind of conversations, what kind of thinking do I need to do about my personal objectives? That's what I want. That's what I want to hear from the clients. That they want to stay in their home. They've thought about it. The home will work. Anyway, so maybe Audrey, can I flip it back to you?
Sure.
So what do you, when people raise this issue, sometimes it's because they've talked to me and
You send them
sure
back.
they should
Yeah.
really be talking to you. What do you talk to them about?
Yeah. Well, we really begin to talk about what is quality of life for them as they age, and what is it that's important to them. If it's important that they are social and they enjoy community work and being with groups, then sometimes staying at home may not be the right aging in place focus. It might be better to age in a community where you see people daily and maybe you don't have to drive to see them anymore. So we really begin to look at quality of life issues. What's important to you? What still gives you value in your life? What gives you a quality of life? And then we begin to look at health needs. Certainly one of the times I think people begin to ask this question is when they're empty nesters and they're looking at the big house and they're trying to decide, should we stay here? Is it age appropriate for us? And then we really look at safety issues for aging in place. Can you make this house safe for you aging in place? If you have stairs, you may not be able to do stairs. Can you bring a bathroom downstairs? These are all the kinds of questions you would begin to ask about aging in place. And then the last issue that I think is important as you begin to ask these questions is, where is your family? Where are your decision makers? You know, I'm of the opinion that at some point in life, family becomes the best medicine. So do you want to stay here if your family's in Kansas City? So in terms of making these kinds of decisions about where to age, it's really those three general areas. Obviously, your health and your safety at home as you age, your quality of life, and where are your decision makers?
Audrey, how do you advise our elders? Because I know from my own parents, they did not want to put a burden on me. And by not putting a burden on me and trying to come to the Boston area, they put more of a burden
Burden on you, yeah.
further away.
Right.
So how do you counsel our elders in that kind of scenario? Because
Right.
I'm sure I'm not
Right.
the only one who has experienced that.
Right. Well, I do have to say that in my experience, there's a bit of a generational divide between every generation about what is a burden and what is not. Okay. However, with that said, I think it's all about communication and the idea of communicating your wishes way ahead of time and planning for them. The reality is we have no crystal balls. You know, we don't know. I don't know if I'm going to have macular degeneration and can't see and then can't drive. No one knows that. But you do know what Don is beginning to talk about, which is, what are your life goals? What would you like it to be like? And have you communicated that in a way that your children, adult children, or decision makers are able to make that happen? So, you know, Tracy, I move folks often from one area of the country to the Boston area because their kids are here. And they both wanted it. And it was discussed and they both wanted to do that.
Don, can you speak a little bit about finances and sheltering finances for nursing facilities, assisted living facilities, and even for having caregivers come into the home? There's all kinds of ramifications. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Let me step back a little bit with that and just phrase the question or the issue a little bit more broadly. The issue is one of really identifying different kinds of resources and mapping out a way of matching the resources to what you're trying to accomplish. Those resources, when we talk about asset protection, we're often talking about the Medicaid program, Mass Health, the Medicaid program in Massachusetts specifically. But I'll get to that, but I want to just step back. People have both human resources, and some financial resources. Their human resources are family members, and they have to think about what role they may play, including, residency kinds of arrangements. Actually, some very exciting things are happening in Newton itself right now, and in other states, other cities, in Massachusetts and elsewhere, where zoning laws are being changed in a way which can make it more, and it's one of the reasons they're being changed, more feasible. Kind of multi-generational family living to go on in, for instance, in one of those large houses on West Newton Hill, but with an in-law apartment. As a, separate, separate freestanding, could be internal or external, or in the old, in the carriage house in the back. But the idea is that either for the elder to have a source of rent with tenants, or for the elder to live in the apartment and have someone else or family members live in the main house, maybe really an excellent way of dealing with some of these long-term issues. So beyond human resources, people have whatever they have. They may have a small amount or they may have a large amount. They may have very little cash, but a big house. They may have IRAs, but very little liquid resources. They may have not much of anything. Whatever they have, you can plan well or poorly with that. There are lots of things that can be done with a house just mentioning that one, zoning changes and others. House can be sold, reverse mortgages, home equity lines of credit. There are ways you can access the cash that's available in the house. Audrey, I think you had a.
Yeah, I was just going to add to tell the audience that, I think the exciting thing is there are more and more options available to us today that perhaps our parents didn't have, okay? Which is why it's even more important that you plan and educate and do your research ahead of time. Because, as Don's mentioning all of these options, there's so many. The good news is there are a lot of them.
So it's not one size fits all. Is that what, is that?
Absolutely right. The days of going to just going to assisted living or just going to the nursing home are over. There are lots and lots of options. Don's talking about some of the tax credits for housing. There are village models now, there are mid-rise models now. I mean, there are all kinds of options. So I didn't interrupt you, Don, but just wanted to throw that out there for the audience.
Excellent. Right.
And definitely,
So aside from your house as a resource and your family, you also have whatever savings you have, and there's a financial planning question there. This is also kind of an illustration of the kind of the interdisciplinary nature of planning in this area for it really to work. I can't do my job without somebody advising the family about personal issues. I can't do it effectively if they're not well using their finances and they're not invested properly. So financial planning is a piece of this. And then the last piece is sort of the government benefits piece. This can be a primary resource for people who don't have much of anything of their own, can be a secondary resource. Sometimes it's just not really a feasible resource at all. Long-term care insurance is another option that still exists for people, and especially if they're doing this planning in advance before they have a condition that's going to disqualify them from coverage or make it unduly expensive, it may be well worth exploring, particularly when you understand the limitations that exist in the Medicaid system as a source of support for long-term care. And I want to dwell on that for a few minutes. There's much more information on the paper. But so older people have Medicare. At 65, you have Medicare even if you're not getting Social Security yet. Medicare, is hospital benefits and medical benefits. It's really an acute care medical support system. It's more like what you used to call major medical stuff. It's intended to deal with illnesses and injuries and primarily the short-term aftermath of hospitalizations. Rehab, be in a rehab facility or a nursing home, but it's time limited per spell of illness, per incident. Some care is available at home, but only if you're homebound and only for a limited period of time and a limited amount of money. PT, OT are available on an outpatient basis, but again, it's sort of in the aftermath of the stroke. At some point, it's going to disengage from you. It doesn't provide long-term care. Long-term care supports are really what you have in the bank, long-term care insurance, and Medicaid. That's really it. It's important to explore long-term care insurance because it'll give you the greatest number of options in terms of choosing facilities and kinds of facilities. There are lots of ways of setting it up where it can be for both spouses. There are flexible ways of handling it. You can get some control on the cost by tailoring the policy you're getting. You don't have to think of it as a policy that's going to cover every dollar of expense. You just want to use it to avoid, being impoverished by this need. So you'll hopefully have something left for your kids, but you're not, so scope down the amount that you're looking for. Give yourself a longer elimination period before it starts paying. Look at what the cost implications are of larger deductibles. Those are the things, the elimination period, you may well be able to afford. If you have to pay privately for 6 months even, you have enough resources for that, knowing that from the 6-month point through 5 years, you're going to be covered. So don't necessarily look for it to start paying after 30 days. I think one of the things that, Audrey, you probably know more about this than I do, but just sort of looking at the statistics on, given all of these options that people have now, people are going into nursing homes later, in the sense of closer to the end of their life. Those placements in nursing homes are not as long-term as they were. You'll always find exceptions. You'll find extraordinary cases of people who went in early and got very healthy for the first time. But generally speaking, that's not where you spend your last years. It's at home, maybe it's in assisted living, and then it's the last piece, maybe even going there for
Last few
hospice
months.
is in the
Yeah.
nursing home,
Yeah.
not for years.
Yeah.
So if someone's in an assisted living and they go into the hospital and then need to go to rehab, do they go back to the assisted living or they have to go to a separate facility for the rehab? How does that work?
It depends on the facility, it depends on the communities
Mhm.
and what they offer. First of all, Medicare will only cover rehab in what they call certified beds or certified communities. So you can't go to just any place. You have to go to what's called a certified rehab bed. Assisted livings don't frequently have those kinds of situations unless it's part of a greater continuing care community, often referred to as a CCRC, where they have the spectrum of care levels: independent, assisted, long-term care beds.
And what about observation? I know from my own experience with my mother, she was admitted at times for observation. So how many days, if you're in a rehab, can you stay that it's covered? And in terms of a hospital with observation?
So first of all, Medicare requires, okay, that you're in the hospital admitted. Okay, you have to be admitted, not in the ER hallway waiting or under the ER for any kind of an observation. You have to be admitted into the hospital and stay 3 nights before Medicare will pay for a bed in a rehab situation. Okay, that's not
Don't assume
guaranteed.
that because they moved,
Say again?
don't assume that because they've moved you.
Right,
Don't assume that because they've moved you
Right.
into a room from the ER and you're
Right.
staying overnight, that
That's
you've
right.
actually been admitted. You
So
feel
one night.
admitted.
You have to
But the
make
paper doesn't
sure
say you're
you're
admitted.
admitted into the hospital in order for Medicare to pick up any discharge plan for you.
Now
And
you have to ask this because there is an exception here. There's a new program that many hospitals and nursing homes are
Right.
enrolling in, that they're trying to avoid the need for the 3 days, and they will in fact make a placement out on Medicare. So it's something you just need to clarify when you first.
you have to get
Let me
clarification.
just say a word about the
Yeah.
Medicaid issues. I'm looking; it's already. Yeah. So on the Medicaid, I have about 2.5 pages on the paper on Medicaid planning. I put it in quotes because I really hate that term. It sort of focuses on Medicaid per se, when I think Medicaid may be something you need to explore and maybe some things you can do to facilitate future eligibility. But because Medicaid pays really only for that nursing home placement, which is getting to be less and less an important part of an elder's older years typically, sort of gearing everything toward Medicaid planning and just focusing on that, I think really runs the risk of you, by making assets inaccessible, transferring them to your kids or putting them in a revocable trust, you run the risk of depriving yourself of access to options that won't be covered by Medicaid. Also, we don't know what Medicaid is going to look like next year, let alone in years or 10.
That's right.
So to take actions now, which are going to tie you in knots, limit your flexibility and control on the expectation that you're going to be eligible in 5 years, or that eligibility is really going to be for anything that you want, is really a big risk.
Yeah.
So there's details on transfers, on trusts, and so forth in the paper. Let me just skip over that then for the talk. And if anybody doesn't have the paper and they want it, just email or put it on the email Tracy. She'll get it. She'll get it.
Oh, yes.
The other question I just wanted to try at Celery 712. I just wanted to try to reach something else we talked about is sort of this, it's kind of the last stage. This is the,
Like-
trying to minimize chaos and limit the, you know, anxiety and difficulties that families have in dealing with a person's financial affairs after he has died. This is builds on this notion of I'm a private person, I don't want my kids involved, they're too busy anyway. Sometimes that leads to a situation where that older person is the only one who knows anything about a very complicated set of financial ramifications. And in that case, we've just seen so many horrible situations where the family doesn't have access to cash, don't know where the accounts are, don't know where the creditors are, don't know the bills to be paid, don't have access to, you know, all of these computerized records. They don't have the passwords. They don't have the access to the password app that you've spent hours getting ready to go. So I think people just have to get over that, the idea that it's completely private and the kids don't need to know it now. They'll find out when they need to know it. If there's an interest in trying to make that transition just as fluid as possible, the emotional devastation caused by the human loss is going to be great enough to compound that with just anxiety about finances and about ignorance in finances, about not knowing. You're not even going to be able to start with a lawyer and getting things figured out until you have that information. If you have it, it can be a piece of cake.
Yeah. You know, the end of life cycle goes very quickly in terms of care. And the last thing you want your family member doing is chasing down passwords at this time. So anything you can do ahead of time to alleviate that is helpful.
This is also just getting your estate plan in order, make sure your will is up to date and it does what you want it to do. The critical thing where people fall down is with their retirement accounts. We see the will, although it's the last will and testament, sounds like it has some sacred long-term turf, really doesn't do much today. It deals only with assets that are in your name individually. They generally don't cover retirement accounts, joint accounts, accounts that you're holding in trust for another person, accounts that are payable on death to another individual in banks or brokerage accounts. Retirement life insurance goes to beneficiaries, retirement accounts go to beneficiaries. So you really have to have a full listing of what you've got and figure out with your attorney, where you want everything to go. If you say, I want everything to go in equal shares to my kids, and you put that in your will, but nothing you have passes under the will, it's not going to end up where you want it to go. You have to coordinate the will and things that pass under the will with your trust and with the things that pass outside of the will.
You know, I'm mindful it's 7:15. If people have questions to put in the chat,
Correct.
please do.
That would be great. Let's see. I think there was a question. Let's see.
So just so we're clear, all of the documents we spoke about today were in the attachments that Tracy sent out last night. If you got last night's email with the link, it's above that. The Vial of Life, the MOLS, Don's papers, they're all part of this email that was sent to you last night.
We're planning to keep this as a kind of a resource library for the course. I don't know how long it'll stay that way, but that was one of the objectives. We're going to be adding to it. I'm working on another paper just on trust. Some papers relate to more than one program, but it's going to be all the topics we're covering. And I think that also, I know that, one of the reasons why I think the program was asking for registration was just so that we would have the email addresses to use to send the stuff to people.
Correct.
So if you
Right.
want
I
to
sent out all the attachments.
it's
Correct.
just to be able to get notice about changes in the program or updates on the papers and the program materials. So if you haven't registered, I just suggest you would do, and then we'll get the material to you either before the program, sometimes it'll be after the program, but we'll be talking about its availability.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Audrey, do you? I don't really see any specific questions. If
No,
any-
I was just directing people to do that.
Yeah, I don't really see any questions. So we still have a couple more minutes. I have a question, Dawn, for you. I have some
Yeah.
older relatives, and they've told me in the past that they prepaid for their funeral, and I was aghast that somebody would do that. But
Yeah.
tell us, is that
Yeah.
good advice to do that? I guess I'm a little bit more superstitious about like planning for something like that. So what are your thoughts in terms of for legal advice?
Well, all right. So there are a couple of ways of doing it. One is prepaid, and one is just sort of setting up the arrangement, opening the account. You don't actually have to pay. But I think the advantage of at least the arrangement is huge for the family. Um, the I've been in a situation where I've had to make arrangements. Wasn't for parent, uncle, but who had not made arrangements beforehand, and I was sort of the designated person to go down and make the arrangements in the literally the night before the funeral, and it's excruciatingly difficult. And if the family has to do it directly, it's unbelievably difficult depending on the circumstances. So I think that if it's a blessing to the family to go and do it. It's not that hard to do. You just sit down, you choose you make your choices. It's a little bizarre, but you make, if you want the plain pine box, you get the plain pine box. The family isn't later kind of shamed into getting the mahogany thing. It can really help the family not deal with the decisions on the basis of guilt or being frantic or just going with whatever is recommended. Um, the prepayment can be helpful in some specific instances. For instance, relating to Medicaid eligibility, if a person has some excess assets but not much, using money to prepay a funeral and burial arrangement for yourself or your spouse or both is a permissible use of the funds at the last minute. So it can be useful that way. Beyond that, there is some sort of cost of living protection built into paying early. The costs for the home, at least, aren't going to increase. They're built into the insurance that the money is actually used to purchase. But I think that going and opening the account, letting them know what you want, letting the family know that you've made those arrangements, then it's a matter of just the wherever the person is when they die. If they're in the nursing home, the nursing home's going to want to know who to call, and they'll know. You'll tell them, and it'll be just that one call to make instead of the call to begin arrangements.
Okay, that seems like a smoother process. You just have to get over the superstitious part of it. We have a question in the chat for Dawn. It says, all our significant financial assets and our house are either jointly owned or controlled by a pay on death beneficiary forms and will pass directly, but not through probate. Should we nevertheless have a will, and should the survivor apply for some kind of probate, presumably the small estate provision? If so, why or why not?
All right. Well, first, I think that a couple of things. First, about the will itself. Even in a situation where you presently have no assets that would be subject to the will. For example, on the joint ownership issue, if both people die in a common accident or one dies shortly after the other, you may end up with an asset which is individually held. Also, if you die in an accident, there may be an accident recovery or settlement coming years later to find a way into your estate plan, and it's too late to make a payable on death arrangement for that. So you sort of need one, at least on a standby basis, even if it's a simple one. The payable on death arrangements or transfer on death arrangements are increasingly available with banks and brokerage houses. What this means is that during your lifetime, you have complete and sole control, but the financial institution has been instructed that on a showing of your death certificate, they're authorized to just give the stuff directly to the person who's identified. It's a perfectly good way to avoid probate. It has some limitations, though, in comparison with a revocable trust or a living trust. One is that if the designated beneficiary isn't alive, then the situation ends and it ends in probate. Whereas in a revocable trust, you can transfer the asset to the revocable trust during your lifetime, so there's no probate. But the trust itself can provide the what ifs. What if the primary person isn't alive? It would go to his children. If the children are under 25, it would go in trust for the children. Another person as the trustee. So it's much more complete solution. The other problem with it is that it can sometimes be difficult to manage in the context of overall desire to have equal treatment of your kids within the family. If you've got a bunch of accounts sort of sorted out with different POD designations, payable on death designations, you're going to spend from those accounts differently during your lifetime, and things can get way out of whack. We had a situation years ago where the parents and one of their kids, the parents had one of their children as a third joint owner on their house. And the other children it was a revocable trust. The other kids had equal shares of what was left in the revocable trust. At the time that they did this, the numbers were roughly workable. But this happened to be a house in Concord. The value of the house, although it wasn't much of a house, the house, grew into millions of dollars, and the parents spent all of their cash on their care. So it ended up in a situation where the son inherited several $1,000,000 and his sisters got virtually nothing. Not a great happiness, and it certainly wasn't the parents' plan. So it's another just problem in relying on those informal designations. If all of this stuff had gone into a revocable trust, the trust itself would then at that point parcel things out in the fractions they were looking for, and also be able to make special arrangements if there were special needs within the family or the grandchildren. If there was a need for a continuing trust for one of the grandchildren or anything like that, could be handled in the context of the trust.
Yeah, I don't think there are any other questions from anyone. You have to put them in the chat. I don't see anything else. Audrey, do you see any questions in the chat?
We think we're good.
I think we're good.
Good. All right. Well, we want to get done before 7:30 because people have other commitments. So if you want to send in additional questions in the
I
chat,
just saw something here.
Oh, so the same person who asked that question said, the person that I just asked the question, it says, but if we do that, what you told us, should the survivor apply for probate? The person who asked the question said, but if we do what you told us, Dawn, should the
all right.
survivor apply for probate?
You may need to. Yeah, if you have.
They would need to apply.
You would have to. If there's a surviving joint owner dies owning the house, probate would be necessary. If instead of joint ownership, if it had gone into a revocable trust, then probate wouldn't be necessary on the death of the survivor. It would continue on. The distribution would go to the kids also without need for probate. So the POD and such are it's a short-term solution, but you could end up costing much more than revocable trust approach, just depending on how things evolve after you set it up.
Okay. Any other questions? You want to just give us another, if we have another couple minutes, just, I know in my own experience, I tried to avoid probate as best as I could for my parents. And I had something set up called a voluntary administration form. Can you tell us the difference between those two? It's still part of probate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they're probate code was rewritten. Yeah, the probate code was completely rewritten in recent years. There are different tiers of probate that are appropriate depending on the level of assets that need to be. The size of that one bank account that everybody forgot about. It depends on those sizes. There's also supervised versus unsupervised probate. In friendly family situations where there's no conflict, you can do this on an unsupervised basis, which saves a lot of money and time and energy. The court really doesn't get involved. Everybody has to agree, but it's much more informal. There's even some procedures for not in court at all. For small bank accounts, there's a procedure where you can go just directly to the bank, and they can settle very small accounts.
So for people whose families,
there's a voluntary administration.
for people whose families don't have huge means, they shouldn't be scared that they have to go through a big probate process, that you're saying that things could be done in a much smaller way.
Yeah, yeah. And typically, a lot of stuff today, so much goes through retirement accounts, which doesn't touch probate anyway. Probate is really, sometimes parents want probate because there is conflict in the family. They want to have somebody overseeing that and making sure it works properly. It's actually something that's helpful to the situation rather than leaving it to the kids to sort of settle out themselves if they're afraid that they're not going to be able to resolve things themselves.
So the takeaway from tonight,
But generally speaking,
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, generally speaking, we try to avoid probate, but it's again, start with the objectives. What do you want trying to accomplish, and then see how much you can minimize probate while still accomplishing that. Don't start with the objective of avoiding probate. Start with what you're trying to do with yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dawn and Audrey. This was very, very helpful. And I think Audrey's advice to keep something on the refrigerator, that's simple advice, because we all get worried and stressed in the last minute, or put it in a pocketbook or something like that, because trying to locate forms that you put away in a closet, in a box somewhere far beyond, and try to set this all up way before a problem occurs. So thank you so much. And we actually ended on time this time, so that's wonderful. Let's see, our next session is Tuesday, December 8th. And it's entitled, "I Can't Believe This Is Happening to Us." This talks about early stage Alzheimer's disease, legal and financial care concerns, which is for many people, this is really a very important session, and the special case of younger onset Alzheimer's disease. So this is Tuesday, December 8th at 6:15. I want to thank Dawn Friedman and Audrey Zabin very, very much for doing this. And I want to again acknowledge Benchmark for supporting our program. And thank you so much. If they're on and they did not receive an email, just email me and I will send out